At the start of May, Forestry Minister Shane Jones vowed to introduce greater regulation on log processing here at home to ensure the domestic market had sufficient log supply, rather than logs being sent to more lucrative markets. And a great story recently by Richard Rennie on farmersweekly.co.nz, Jones said the COVID-19 crisis showed how an over-reliance on log exports to a few markets makes the industry heavily reliant on them for its success. Now, joining us now to discuss the situation is Marty Verry from Red Stag. Marty, firstly, welcome to Sarah's Country again. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, no trouble.
Now, how does the government support more economically viable domestic processing?
Let me echo the minister's points there about over-reliance on China. We export about 60% of our logs and 80% of those go to China. And China has its own plans to be self-sufficient. A few years ago, it locked up its own forests with targeting being self-sufficient in the 2030s. And that's going to kind of coincide with the likely decline in the urbanization process in China, which means, we're planting all these trees in New Zealand. We've developed this billion tree policy, and we're all assuming that the logs are going to go to China, but China's got its own self-sufficiency plans, and the whole rest of the world has got billion tree policies. Australia's got it. There's a trillion tree United Nations policy that the United States has signed up to. So relying on China for these logs is risky, really risky. And our country's whole carbon offset structure plan is based on being able to meet our climate change emissions by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through forests. And so, the lack of a customer base, of a major customer, losing a major customer is a big problem. So that brings us on to kind of what we do about it, and that's where we and the minister want to see a massive increase in the utilisation of timber in New Zealand. We want it to be the dominant building material. It's already dominant in smaller houses, but we want it dominant in the larger buildings in New Zealand. And if it can get to about 2/3 of buildings in New Zealand, it means New Zealand's building structures can be carbon neutral.
Marty, you've been in the game for a while. When was the turning point in our construction that we moved away from wooden houses?
Oh, no. The wooden houses are very, very dominant. They're still up at over 90% of the market share for houses up to 2 or 3 stories. It's more the commercial buildings and the mid-rise and the high-rise things. I mean, there's wooden buildings going up to 20, 25 stories now, with plans afoot to go up to 100 stories in Tokyo. So, and around the world, actually, they're really pushing the limits with new products that are available, like cross-laminated timber, LVL, glulam. These mass products are very, very strong and light, and they lend themselves to very high vertical construction. So that's the market share we're after, and that's where, in 10 years' time, we want that to be the norm, wood to be the norm. We want people to walk past a building and look at it, and if it's concrete and steel, we want to say, why are these people polluting the environment like that? Because that's where it's heading in terms of the urgency to address climate change. And and building materials account for about 10% of New Zealand's climate change emissions profile.
So I understand you're the largest sawmill in the Southern Hemisphere. Marty, there was a lot of government proposals or presentations by smaller operators worried that they wouldn't have the ability to have economies of scale because of their own lack of investment into technology such as you have made. How do you think the playing field's going to look in another 10, 20 years?
Well, there's a continuous rationalisation of the sector around larger, more automated sawmills. And with this downturn we're coming into now, we're going to see, I think, quite an acceleration of that consolidation process. It's been going on all around the world and New Zealand for decades and decades. There used to be hundreds of sawmills in New Zealand, and that trend will continue. You've either got to really get niche or get very, very, very efficient to be able to compete. And so I think it's just a natural thing that some won't be competing. The log suppliers are making choices about who they back and who's a stable counterparty to get them behind. And when they see someone becoming resilient and strong, having reinvested and being the lowest cost producer, then they can supply them. So I guess this bill that's come in or been proposed doesn't really affect us so much. We have very, very good log supply relationships and long-term agreements with big institutional foresters that support the efficient scale operators domestically. And I think, like I said, in the 2030s, they're all going to be looking for domestic customers because the offshore markets could dry up.
Certainly. Now, the carbon zero construction policy, a national procurement strategy that you're in support of, could you tell us a bit more about the flow-on effect of that policy?
Yeah, well, we're pushing for this policy to be adopted by government. It's the same policy as the Labor government, supported by the Labor Party, supported by the Greens and the New Zealand First Party, backed and going into the last election. They made an election promise to implement what's called a wood first policy, but we call it carbon zero construction because I think it doesn't need to be wood specific. It's just whatever's going to be delivering a carbon zero result in 2030 so that we can hit our 2050 deadlines. But it's going to drive massive amounts of carbon sequestration. Not only are the trees going to be obviously sequestering a lot more carbon, but also we're going to be replacing steel and concrete or cement imported from offshore, which is highly, highly polluting. If concrete was a country, the world's concrete was a country, to be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. That's how much it emits. So we've got to get serious about this climate change, and New Zealand's got a 10% slither where it can eliminate in the next 10 years if it moves rapidly to utilisation and maximisation of wood. So COVID's come along as well. There's obviously very significant job opportunities. A dollar spent on wood products from New Zealand employs for every person employed, and directly employs 2.7 more people. So there's about 400,000 New Zealanders, including their families, supported by that sector. Obviously, a dollar that gets spent on heavy steel or cement from Indonesia or Thailand or China very quickly goes offshore, and we don't get that recurring benefit to the country from it. So it's another great reason post-COVID to really get in behind that policy and make sure we push it through now.
Ross, the other thing too that we don't benefit from is selling our land into overseas owned forestry here in New Zealand for, of course, that offshore processing. What can we do about that?
We're reasonably comfortable. Our major suppliers are mainly owned by offshore owners of the forests, especially if they're large institutions with large forests that are harvesting throughout the rotation years, because they don't want to try to sort of pick the peaks because they can't sort of dry off their harvesting and planting and silviculture crews. So they are actually really, often the foreign owners, if they're not buying the forests and planting them to take back to their own countries, which is kind of like the China strategy. If they're doing it for pure investment, then they will look after the local producers here. That's been our experience. Not all processors will get that same support because maybe they're not strategic, or maybe they're just not reinvesting, or that maybe the forester sees them as a credit risk. And I think you can't ask the foresters to take that risk if they perceive it as real.
Yeah, fantastic. No, it's very interesting to see it from across the board because, of course, capital is something that we lack in New Zealand as well, and the onshore processing has so many elements to it, and the flow-on effect for jobs as well. Marty, I'm in full support of your carbon zero construction policy. Coming from a wool family, this is exactly what we need, and there's a lot of other carbon zero construction such as hempcrete. That is only just emerging. So there's lots of exciting things. Now, talking about locking up carbon, there's a lot of locked up carbon behind you right now. That's a very interesting build.
Yeah, I'm actually coming to you from New Zealand's oldest building. This building was constructed originally in the 1780s in New York State by the pioneers that went in there. And a few years ago, we moved two of these barns across to a lifestyle block north of Auckland and still live in them. So it's a good story about locking up, carbon dioxide for hundreds of years, because these trees would have started their life more than 300 years ago. So it just demonstrates what's possible with wood, because you can move it around. You don't have to sort of smash it apart And that's kind of where it's going as well with the future of urban development and buildings, is being able to say, okay, how do I reuse this? How do I pull it apart? And that lends itself to wood as well, because it's easy to put the stuff together and it's easier to take that stuff apart and move it. As cities grow and something's not needed in that location, it can be moved, reused. This is a perfect example.
Yeah, fantastic. It's been lovely chatting to you, Marty. Marty is the Chief Executive for Red Stag Group. They're talking around the new domestic policies that are coming into place affecting the oversupply or over-reliance potentially of New Zealand wood exports into places such as China.
This is Sarah's Country.